The storm had already torn 3 shutters from the east wing before anyone noticed Jesselyn standing silent and apart from the table. Wind howled through the corridors of Dunmere Hall while rain hammered against the enormous dining room windows with enough force to rattle the silver candlesticks lining the mantelpiece. 40 guests sat beneath the glow of 6 chandeliers, wrapped in silk and velvet, pretending the fury outside did not exist, while servants rushed between chairs, carrying trays of roasted venison and honeyed wine. Near the far wall, half hidden behind a marble column and the flickering edge of candlelight, Jesselyn Dunmere stood watching her family celebrate without her. Nobody had invited her to sit. Nobody had noticed she remained standing. Ravina lifted her glass lazily, watching the storm through half-closed eyes before turning her attention across the table. Has anyone seen our eldest sister this evening? Or has she finally accepted her position among the kitchen staff, permanently? Laughter rippled through the guests closest to her. Corabelle pressed a gloved hand against her mouth, smiling behind it with practiced cruelty, while Lord Everard Dunmere continued cutting his meat without acknowledging the remark. Floriane leaned forward with a sweetness designed to wound. Perhaps she is mending something again. Curtains, tablecloths, her dignity. Honestly, she repairs everything in this household, except her own prospects. Even louder laughter filled the dining room. Lady Perpetua straightened her posture sharply without looking at anyone. Enough, we have guests. But her voice carried no warmth, only the cold discipline of a woman protecting appearances rather than her daughter. Lord Everard finally set his knife down and addressed the table with the same tone he used when discussing failed investments. Every child born under this roof was given the same opportunities. Some simply lacked the conviction to use them wisely. The silence that followed pressed against the walls harder than the storm outside. Guests exchanged glances while candlelight flickered beneath the force of wind pushing through unseen cracks in the ancient stone. Jesselyn's fingers tightened against the fabric of her gown where nobody could see. Then a deafening crash echoed from the front entrance. Every head turned. A servant appeared at the dining room doorway, soaked from head to boots, his face drained of color. Forgive the interruption, my lord. A carriage has overturned beyond the North Bridge. The river has flooded the road entirely. The passengers are requesting shelter until the storm passes. Lord Everard waved his hand dismissively. Then, offer them the servants' quarters, and send them away at first light. The servant swallowed, visibly. My lord, the passenger is Duke Cashel Aldermore. The dining room fell into absolute silence. Forks stopped mid-air. Lady Perpetua's wineglass froze against her lips. Lord Everard's face darkened with something far deeper than surprise, something ancient and bitter and barely controlled. No member of that family has crossed this threshold in 23 years. Before anyone could respond, lightning split the sky beyond the windows, illuminating the entire room in white. And standing in the corridor behind the trembling servant, drenched in rain with blood running from a cut above his brow, was Duke Cashel Aldermore himself. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional royal dramas filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful revenge, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support the channel, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. Long before the storm brought an enemy through her family's doors, Jesselyn Dunmere had already learned to become invisible. She woke each morning before the household stirred, while dawn pressed thin gray light through the narrow windows of her bedroom at the far end of the east corridor. Her room sat furthest from the family wing, positioned beside the linen closets and the old servants' staircase, a detail nobody had questioned for years because nobody thought about Jesselyn long enough to question anything. By the time her sisters descended for breakfast in embroidered morning gowns with their hair arranged by personal maids, Jesselyn had already inspected the kitchens, confirmed deliveries with the cook, reviewed the day's menu, and resolved at least one argument between servants before the household even noticed she existed. She moved through Dunmere Hall, the way candlelight moved through corridors. Present everywhere, credited for nothing. The estate itself demanded constant attention. Dunmere Hall had stood for over 200 years on the edge of the Cumbrian Fells, overlooking a valley where mist gathered each morning like smoke trapped between green walls. Its stone corridor stretched endlessly beneath vaulted ceilings, darkened by centuries of hearth smoke, while drafty chambers and unreliable fireplaces kept servants busy from dawn until midnight. The roof leaked above the east gallery whenever rain arrived from the north. The cellar flooded twice each winter, ruining provisions if Jesselyn did not arrange drainage before the first heavy frost. Managing a house this old required patience, precision, and thankless endurance. Jesselyn possessed all three. She supervised repairs to crumbling window frames without being asked. She balanced household accounts that Lady Perpetua found tedious, and Lord Everard considered beneath his attention. She remembered the names of every servant's child, knew which kitchen maid suffered headaches during storms, and quietly arranged extra blankets for the elderly gardener who slept in the cottage behind the stables during winter. None of this earned her a single word of recognition. During gatherings, guests frequently mistook her for household staff. One evening, a visiting baroness handed Jesselyn an empty teacup and asked for a fresh pot, without ever realizing she was speaking to Lord Everard's eldest daughter. Jesselyn simply took the cup, poured fresh tea, and returned it with a gentle smile. She never corrected anyone. Correction required the belief that someone would care about the mistake, and Jesselyn had stopped believing that years ago. Another time, a retired admiral visiting from Bath complimented the roast lamb to Jesselyn directly and asked her to pass his gratitude to the cook, adding a 6-pence tip before realizing his error and retreating in embarrassment. Jesselyn pocketed the coin without a word and later gave it to Tansy for sweets. Her sisters occupied an entirely different world inside the same house. Vina, the second eldest, moved through every room with the sharp confidence of a woman who understood exactly how much power her beauty carried. She dressed in imported silks, spoke in clever remarks designed to earn admiration, and treated every social gathering as a stage built specifically for her performance. Corabelle preferred quieter control. She collected alliances the way other women collected brooches, befriending wives of influential men while positioning herself carefully within every conversation that mattered. Floriane, the youngest, possessed a beauty so effortless that strangers sometimes paused mid-sentence when she entered a room. She had grown so accustomed to admiration that she wielded cruelty without recognizing it, the way a child might swing a blade thinking it was a toy. Together, the three sisters formed a circle Jesselyn had been quietly excluded from since before she could remember exactly when it happened. It had not always been this way. Once, years ago, Jesselyn had laughed as freely as any of them. She had played piano beside the tall library windows while afternoon sunlight warmed the keys beneath her fingers. She had debated philosophy with visiting scholars and surprised guests with observations sharp enough to shift entire dinner conversations. But something had broken inside her during her 24th year, something the family never discussed, and the woman who emerged afterward carried silence where laughter had once lived. Now, at 31, Jesselyn existed within the walls of her family's estate, the way old furniture existed, useful, overlooked, and moved only when it became inconvenient to leave in place. One gray afternoon, weeks before the storm that changed everything, Jesselyn found young Tansy crying beside the scullery entrance. The girl, barely 14, served as the lowest kitchen maid and had burned her wrist badly while lifting a heavy pot of boiling stock. Jesselyn knelt immediately. "Let me see, sweetheart." The burn stretched angry and red across the inside of the girl's thin wrist. Jesseline tore a strip of clean linen from her own petticoat without hesitation, soaked it gently in cool water from the nearest pitcher, and wrapped the wound carefully while speaking softly enough to steady the girl's breathing. "You will be perfectly fine. Hold this against the skin and change the cloth every hour. And here." She reached into her apron pocket and produced a small sugared almond she had taken from the dessert preparation earlier. "Our secret." Tansy managed a shaky smile through her tears. "Thank you, Miss Jesseline. You are the only one who ever notices." The words settled inside Jesseline's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She squeezed the girl's hand gently, then stood and continued walking before the emotion behind her face became visible to anyone watching. Moments later, Lady Perpetua appeared at the end of the corridor with her mouth already pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "The Ashworth guests are arriving within the hour. You have not yet confirmed the seating arrangements for tonight." "I completed them this morning, Mother. They are on the study desk beside Father's correspondence." Lady Perpetua studied her eldest daughter for a long, silent moment. Something almost resembling guilt flickered briefly behind her eyes before vanishing entirely. "Try to look presentable tonight. People notice when you appear tired." Then she turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Jesseline standing alone in the dim corridor, while cold afternoon light faded slowly through the windows above. The hatred between House Dunmere and House Aldermore did not begin with politics or money. It began with a death. 23 years before the storm, Lord Everard Dunmere's younger brother, Sir Alistair, had travelled to the Aldermore estate near the northern coast to negotiate a joint investment in shipping routes connecting Cumbria to continental ports. The Dunmers and Aldermores had been cautious allies at the time, bound by mutual business interest rather than friendship, but the arrangement had functioned well enough to benefit both families considerably. What happened during that visit remained disputed between the two houses to this day. The Aldermore account claimed Sir Alistair had been drinking heavily throughout the evening and fell from a rain-slicked balcony overlooking the coastal cliffs after wandering outside alone. The Dunmere account insisted Alistair never drank excessively in his life, and that the Aldermores had either caused or deliberately ignored the conditions that led to his death, because the shipping contract had turned unfavorable for them. No court ever settled the matter, no magistrate ever investigated fully. But Lord Everard Dunmere buried his brother beneath the chapel stones at Dunmere Hall and swore publicly before society that no Aldermore would ever again be welcome inside his household, his business dealings, or his life. The feud that followed became one of the most bitter and enduring rivalries among the northern aristocracy. Lord Everard used every ounce of political influence to block Aldermore investments in Cumbrian industry. The old Duke of Aldermore, Cassiel's father, retaliated by financing competitors to Dunmere's mining interests and spreading damaging rumors about the family's financial stability through London banking circles. Friendships between the two families were forbidden. Social gatherings that included one family automatically excluded the other. Even servants who had once worked for both households were treated with suspicion. For Jesseline, the feud had shaped her entire life in ways nobody ever acknowledged. She had been 8 years old when Uncle Alistair died, old enough to remember his laughter echoing through the manor corridors during holiday visits, old enough to remember the way he lifted her onto his shoulders beside the garden lake while she shrieked with delight, old enough to understand even then that something irreplaceable had vanished from her family forever. After the funeral, Lord Everard changed. The warmth he had once carried around his children slowly hardened into something rigid and controlled. Reputation became his obsession. Alliances mattered more than affection. Every decision inside the household began revolving around strength, position, and the relentless need to prove the family had not been weakened by loss. Checked. Jesseline watched the transformation silently from the edges of rooms she was slowly pushed out of, one conversation at a time. By the time she reached 20, the feud had become the central organizing principle of Dunmere life. Lord Everard mentioned the Aldermores with barely contained fury, at least once during every formal dinner. Lady Perpetua used the rivalry to measure loyalty among visiting families, observing carefully whether guests had recently attended Aldermore gatherings before deciding how warmly to receive them. Even the sisters absorbed a hatred instinctively. Ravenna once publicly refused to dance with a young officer after discovering his cousin had married into the Aldermore household. The entire ballroom watched as she turned her back on the mortified man without a word of explanation, and Lord Everard praised her judgment at breakfast the following morning. Corabelle quietly ended a promising friendship with the daughter of a baronet after learning the family had accepted an invitation to the Aldermore autumn hunt. She never explained why. The other girl spent weeks writing unanswered letters before eventually giving up. Floriane, who cared about the feud least among the sisters, still understood the unspoken rule. Aldermore was the enemy. Loyalty was not optional. Only Jesseline carried something more complicated inside her. Grief, certainly. She missed Uncle Alistair with a pain that never fully softened. But she also carried doubt. She had overheard fragments of conversation across the years. Servants whispering about conflicting accounts. A retired solicitor mentioning missing witness statements during a dinner party. Her own mother once murmuring to a friend that Alistair had been behaving strangely for months before the trip. None of it formed a clear picture, but the uncertainty troubled her in ways she could never voice aloud. Questioning the feud within these walls would have been unforgivable. The first time Jesseline was publicly humiliated because of the Aldermore rivalry, she was 25 years old. Lord Everard had arranged a lavish spring banquet to celebrate Ravenna's engagement to Lord Pemberton Hale, a wealthy landowner whose estates bordered Dunmere property to the south. 200 guests filled the great hall, while musicians played beneath enormous tapestries depicting the Dunmere family crest. Jesseline had spent 3 weeks organizing every detail of the celebration, from the imported French wines to the hand-lettered seating cards placed beside every porcelain plate. During the toast, a visiting earl leaned toward Lord Everard with practiced casualness. "I understand young Aldermore has recently returned from abroad, quite the impressive reputation he is building. They say he has doubled the family shipping income within 2 years." Alone, the table fell uncomfortably quiet. Lord Everard's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Ravenna laughed sharply. Perhaps Jesseline should write him a letter. "She seems to have exhausted every eligible gentleman on our side of the county." The cruelty landed with surgical precision. Guests shifted uncomfortably while quiet laughter spread among those too afraid to challenge Ravenna publicly. Corabelle smiled behind her wineglass. Floriane looked away with a practiced air of innocent detachment. Lord Everard did not correct his daughter. Instead, he lifted his glass and redirected the conversation toward Ravenna's wedding arrangements, leaving the remark hanging in the air like smoke no one would acknowledge. Jesseline sat motionless through the remainder of dinner with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her composure perfectly held while something behind her ribs burned slowly and quietly enough that no one at the table ever noticed. Later that evening, she stood alone in the darkened garden while spring rain dampened her shoulders. Through the lit windows behind her, she could still hear music and laughter pouring from the great hall. A moth circled the nearest lantern endlessly, drawn toward light that would eventually destroy it. Jesseline watched the creature for a long time before she understood why it unsettled her. She remained outside until the cold made her fingers numb, then walked back inside through the servants' entrance so nobody would see her returning alone. There had been a time, years before silence became her only companion, when Jesseline Dunmere had known what it felt like to be truly seen. She was 23 when Leoric Ashenden arrived at Dunmere Hall during an unusually warm September. He came as part of a surveying commission hired by Lord Everard to redraw the estate's northern boundary lines, following a land dispute with a neighboring farmer. Unlike the aristocratic men who passed through Dunmere's drawing rooms with rehearsed smiles and calculated conversation, Leoric carried an unguarded quietness about him. He spoke thoughtfully rather than cleverly. He listened before he answered, and he treated every person he encountered, from Lord Everard himself to the boy who carried water for the survey horses, with the same unhurried respect. Their first conversation happened by accident. Jesseline had been reading alone in the garden beside the stone sundial when Leoric passed through carrying rolled survey maps beneath his arm. He noticed the book in her hands and paused. "Herodotus, you read ancient history for pleasure?" Jesseline looked up, startled by the sincerity in the question. Most men who noticed what she read either dismissed it or treated it as an oddity to politely tolerate. "I find comfort in people who lived long enough ago that I cannot be disappointed by them." Leoric laughed, and the sound was so unforced that Jesseline found herself smiling before she could stop it. After that, their conversations became a quiet ritual. Neither of them openly acknowledged. He visited the garden each afternoon under the pretense of reviewing boundary measurements, while Jesseline appeared with different books, always finding reasons to sit near the sundial at exactly the same hour. They discussed cartography and poetry and whether clouds moved differently over the fells than over the lowlands. He showed her how surveyors used triangulation to measure distances across valleys, drawing diagrams in the soil with a stick while she asked questions sharp enough to surprise him repeatedly. "You think differently than anyone I have met inside houses like this," he told her one evening, while autumn light turned the garden amber around them. Jesseline studied the fallen leaves collecting near her shoes. "People inside houses like this stopped listening to me years ago. Then they have been losing something valuable without realizing it. Nobody had ever spoken to her that way. Not with flattery designed to charm, but with recognition so genuine it ached. Since childhood, Jesseline had felt the edges of her loneliness pressing inward. Beside Leoric, those edges softened into something warmer. Mara, who had served the family since before Jesseline was born, and remained the closest thing she had to a confidant, noticed the change almost immediately. "You have been humming again?" the old maid observed quietly one morning while brushing Jesseline's hair. "You have not hummed in years." Jesseline met her own eyes in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. A woman with light behind her gaze instead of carefully managed composure. But warmth inside this household always attracted suspicion before it attracted kindness. Lord Everard discovered the connection on a cold October evening when a servant mentioned seeing Miss Jesseline walking beside the boundary surveyor near the lake for the third consecutive afternoon. Within hours, Lord Everard had summoned his solicitor and demanded a full investigation into Leoric Ashington's family background. The results arrived 2 days later, and they carried exactly the ammunition Lord Everard needed. Leoric's uncle, a merchant operating out of Whitehaven, had conducted shipping business with the Aldermore family for nearly a decade before retiring. The connection was distant, commercial, and entirely irrelevant to Leoric himself. But inside these walls, anything touching the Aldermore name carried the weight of treason. Lord Everard's fury shook the study walls that night. "You brought an Aldermore sympathizer into my home, into proximity with my daughter." Leoric stood calmly before the accusation. "My uncle's former business arrangements have nothing to do with me, my lord. I have never met a single member of the Aldermore family." Lord Everard stepped closer with cold precision in every word. "Any man connected to that name is unwelcome in this household." "You will leave before morning," Jesseline begged. She stood in the corridor outside the study with tears burning down her face while her father's voice carried through the heavy oak doors. "Father, please, he has done nothing wrong. This is unreasonable." Lady Perpetua appeared beside her with a face carved from stone. "Do not make a scene, Jesseline. You are embarrassing yourself." The following morning, Jesseline found Leoric standing near the stable gates, while gray rain fell steadily across the gravel. His surveying equipment had already been loaded onto a borrowed cart. His coat was soaked through. "I will write to you," he said quietly, while holding her hand so tightly she could feel his pulse through his fingers. "Every week, I promise you. Jessalyn nodded through tears she could not control. The cart disappeared down the valley road before the rain swallowed it completely. Jessalyn stood at the gates until her dress clung heavily to her body, and Mara finally came outside with a blanket and led her back indoors without saying a word. The letters never arrived. Jessalyn waited through October, November, December, checking the post tray every morning with a hope that shrank imperceptibly each day. By February, she stopped checking. By spring, she stopped asking. She told herself he had forgotten her, that the promises spoken beside rain-soaked stable gates meant nothing once a man returned to a world where other opportunities waited. What Jessalyn never discovered was that Leoric had written every single week, exactly as he promised. 14 letters arrived at Dunmere Hall between October and January. Lord Everard intercepted every one of them personally and burned them inside his study fireplace, without reading a single word beyond the name written on the envelope. The woman who had once hummed while brushing her hair fell silent that winter and did not recover. The piano in the library gathered dust. The books beside the sundial remained untouched. And Jessalyn slowly became the ghost. Her family would spend the next 7 years pretending not to see. The years that followed Leoric's departure brought 3 engagements to Dunmere Hall. Each one celebrated louder than the last, and each one sharpening the blade that society pressed constantly against Jessalyn's composure. Ravenna married first. Lord Pemberton Hale arrived at Dunmere during a winter hunting party with shoulders broad enough to fill doorways and a reputation for decisiveness that Lord Everard admired instantly. Pemberton spoke in commands rather than conversation. He controlled rooms simply by entering them, and Ravenna, who had spent her entire life wielding her own brand of authority, seemed captivated by the prospect of standing beside someone whose power exceeded her own. The engagement celebration consumed Dunmere Hall for an entire week. Carriages arrived daily from London and Edinburgh carrying imported champagne, silk flower garlands, crates of Belgian chocolate, and enough candlesticks to illuminate the entire valley. Lord Everard spent lavishly and openly, treating the event as a public demonstration of Dunmere prestige. During the engagement dinner, 200 guests raised their glasses while Lord Everard delivered a toast that lasted nearly 10 minutes. My daughter Ravenna has chosen a man worthy of this family's legacy, a union of strength and purpose. The guests applauded generously. Then an elderly countess seated near the far end of the table leaned toward the woman beside her with a whisper clearly intended to carry. And the eldest daughter? She must be nearing 30 now.
Such a pity.
The words drifted across the candlelit table like poison carried by perfume. Ravenna glanced toward Jessalyn with a look that contained no sympathy whatsoever. My sister contributes to the family in her own way. She arranged the flowers this evening beautifully. Polite laughter scattered across the guests. Jessalyn lowered her eyes toward the untouched roast quail on her plate and smiled with practiced composure, while her chest tightened painfully beneath her gown. Yet Jessalyn noticed things during the celebration that others chose to ignore. Pemberton drank heavily throughout every evening. Twice she overheard him correcting Ravenna sharply in private quarters when he believed no one was listening. Once, near the library entrance, his voice carried cold enough to make a passing servant flinch. "I told you not to contradict me before company. Do not mistake my patience for permission." Ravenna's face flickered with something unfamiliar before she straightened her shoulders and walked back toward the guest as though nothing had happened. Jessalyn watched silently from the staircase above, saying nothing because nobody would have listened, even if she had spoken. The wedding itself took place beneath gray February skies 3 months later. Jessalyn organized every element from the floral arrangements lining the church aisle to the reception menu featuring roasted pheasant, buttered asparagus, warm bread rolls dusted with rosemary, and a towering vanilla cake decorated with spun sugar flowers. She stood near the back of the church during the ceremony, watching her sister promise devotion to a man whose grip on Ravina's arm tightened whenever another gentleman looked in her direction. Nobody noticed Jesseline noticing. Nobody ever did. Corabel's engagement followed 14 months later. Lord Dacian Morel possessed precisely the qualities Corabel had spent years quietly cultivating access to. Political connections reaching deep into Westminster, inherited estates across 3 counties, and a reputation among London society as one of the most charming and well-connected men beneath 40. Their courtship had been strategic on both sides, a carefully negotiated alliance between 2 people who understood social positioning better than sentiment. Lord Everard approved enthusiastically. Dacian Morel represented exactly the kind of influence the Dunmere family needed to strengthen their standing against the growing Aldermore presence in northern industry. The engagement banquet glittered with even greater extravagance than Ravina's. Ice sculptures carved into swans lined the ballroom entrance, while servants carried trays of chilled oysters, smoked pheasant, and sparkling wine imported from the Champagne region. Musicians performed a commissioned waltz composed specifically for the occasion. Enormous bouquets of white peonies and trailing ivy framed every doorway, while the scent of warm butter, pastries, roasted venison, and cinnamon-spiced wine drifted through every corridor. Corabel stood beside Dacian beneath a canopy of white roses while guests offered congratulations in a carefully ordered procession. When Jesseline approached to embrace her sister, Corabel smiled warmly enough for the watching guests but whispered something only Jesseline could hear. "Do try to look pleased, Jesseline. Your sadness draws attention from the wrong people." Jesseline maintained her smile until she turned away, then pressed her fingernails into her palms hard enough to leave small white crescents in the skin. During the dancing that evening, she noticed Dacian's gaze wandering repeatedly toward a young widow seated near the musicians. His attention would settle on Corabel briefly, whenever she looked in his direction, then drift away again the moment she turned her head. The pattern repeated throughout the entire evening with the mechanical reliability of a clock. Jesseline recognized the look. It was the face of a man performing devotion rather than feeling it. Florian's engagement arrived with the most spectacle of all. Osric Vanthorpe had built an industrial fortune in textile manufacturing, owning factories across Manchester and Birmingham that employed thousands. He was not aristocratic by birth, but his wealth had earned him access to circles that bloodline alone could no longer guarantee. Lord Everard, whose own finances had begun straining quietly beneath the cost of maintaining the feud against the Aldermores, welcomed Osric's proposal with barely concealed relief. Florian herself seemed genuinely delighted. Osric showered her with gifts so extravagant they became the subject of gossip across the entire county. A sapphire necklace rumored to have cost more than most country estates, a private carriage lined with ivory silk, a wardrobe of Parisian gowns delivered monthly to Dunmere Hall in monogrammed trunks. But Jesseline observed something troubling beneath the generosity. Osric's gifts always arrived with instructions. The sapphire necklace came with a note specifying which events she was permitted to wear it to. The gowns arrived with accompanying sketches indicating precisely how her hair should be styled with each one. Even the carriage carried restrictions. Florian was not to use it for personal visits without Osric's prior written approval. Florian laughed these details away whenever Jesseline gently raised concern. "He simply has particular taste. It means he cares deeply about how we are perceived together." Jesseline studied her youngest sister's face carefully and saw the first fragile cracks forming beneath the excitement. But Florian's eyes still sparkled with the thrill of being chosen, and Jesseline understood that no warning would be heard while that sparkle remained. The engagement dinner confirmed every fear. 300 guests packed the great hall, while an orchestra played from a temporary stage erected beside the enormous stone fireplace. Lord Everard rose for his toast, and this time his words landed with deliberate weight. 3 daughters, 3 exceptional matches. This family has been blessed beyond expectation." He paused. The silence that followed pressed against Jesseline from every direction as dozens of guests instinctively glanced toward the eldest daughter seated quietly at the far end of the table, wearing a modest gray silk gown among a sea of jeweled color. Lord Everard did not look at her. The absence of his gaze carried more cruelty than any words could have delivered. Florian broke the silence with performative gentleness. "Jesseline, you simply must help me choose flowers for the wedding. Nobody arranges them as beautifully as you." The laughter that followed felt like gravel pressed slowly against an open wound. Behind every celebration that filled Dunmere Hall with music and light, Jesseline worked. She worked before dawn, arranging seating charts that Lady Perpetua changed 3 times without apology. She worked through afternoons, directing servants who had not slept in days. She worked past midnight reviewing accounts, confirming deliveries, settling disputes between exhausted kitchen staff, and repairing last-minute disasters that would have embarrassed the family publicly if she had not been quietly standing between the crisis and its consequences. For Ravina's wedding, Jesseline personally rewrote the entire table arrangement after Lady Perpetua discovered that a visiting baroness and her former rival had been seated within speaking distance. The revision took 6 hours. Jesseline completed it before breakfast and received no acknowledgement, beyond a brief nod from her mother. She also spent an entire evening re-sewing torn lace on the bridesmaids' gloves after the London seamstress delivered them, a full size too small, working by candlelight until her fingertips bled through the cloth. For Corabelle's engagement banquet, the ice sculptor hired from London failed to arrive entirely after abandoning the commission without notice. Jesseline located a replacement craftsman from a neighboring village within 3 hours, negotiated a fair price from her own small allowance, because Lord Everard would not authorize additional expense, and supervised the work herself until midnight. When guests admired the sculptures the following evening, Corabelle accepted the compliments without mentioning her sister once. For Florian's celebration, the scale of preparation nearly broke Jesseline physically. Osric Vanthorpe demanded standards of perfection that exceeded anything Dunmere Hall had previously attempted. Every table required identical flower arrangements measured to precise heights. Every wine glass needed polishing until light reflected without distortion. Every napkin was folded into a pattern Osric had selected from a catalog he sent ahead of his arrival. Lady Perpetua placed every responsibility onto Jesseline with the calm efficiency of someone delegating to household staff. "You understand these details better than anyone. I trust your thoroughness entirely." The praise sounded almost warm until Jesseline realized it served no purpose beyond ensuring she could not refuse. She worked for 11 consecutive days preparing for Florian's banquet. Her hands cracked from constant washing and handling of silverware. Dark circles deepened beneath her eyes until even servants began noticing with concern. Old Mara brought her warm broth each night and sat beside her in the kitchen while the rest of the house slept. "You are wearing yourself to nothing for people who would not cross a room to help you," the old maid said quietly one evening, while Jesseline polished the last of 300 dessert spoons. Jesseline continued polishing without looking up. "If I stop, everything falls apart. And then I become the reason it fell apart instead of the reason it held together." Mara studied her face for a long moment, then reached across and gently took the spoon from her hands. "One night of rest will not destroy this family, but destroying yourself for their approval might." Jesseline stared at her own raw, reddened fingers resting empty against the table, and felt something dangerously close to tears pressing against the back of her throat. She swallowed it down the way she had learned to swallow everything and picked up the next spoon. The mockery during celebrations had become so routine that Jesseline barely flinched anymore when it arrived. During Florian's dinner, Ravina announced loudly that Jesseline should receive a formal title for household management, since she clearly had no other titles forthcoming. Corabelle suggested with practiced sweetness that perhaps Jesseline might consider writing a book about organizing grand events, since she would never have occasion to host one of her own. Florian simply smiled and changed the subject with the indifference of someone stepping over a crack in the pavement. Each remark landed precisely where intended. Each one drew quiet laughter from guests too uncomfortable to challenge the cruelty and too entertained to look away from it. But the deepest wound arrived late one evening, 3 days after Florian's celebration ended and the final guests departed. Jesseline was carrying folded linens through the upper corridor when she heard her parents' voices drifting through the half-open study door. Lady Perpetua spoke first. "The situation has become untenable, Everard. She is 31 years old. Every gathering produces whispers. Every banquet draws questions we cannot answer gracefully." Lord Everard's chair creaked heavily. "What would you suggest? My sister Adeline has offered to take her." "The cottage near Windermere. It is modest, but respectable. Far enough from society that people would simply forget with time." A long silence followed. Jesseline stood frozen in the corridor, clutching the linens against her chest, while her heartbeat roared so loudly inside her skull she feared they might hear it through the wall. Then Lord Everard spoke with the finality of a man closing a ledger. "After Christmas, arrange it quietly. I do not want another scene." Jesseline's knees nearly buckled. She pressed her shoulder against the cold corridor wall to keep herself upright, while the linens slipped slowly from her arms and pooled silently at her feet. They were sending her away. Not because she had failed them, but because her existence had become an inconvenience they could no longer manage publicly. She walked to her bedroom without collecting the fallen linens, without lighting a candle, without removing her shoes. She sat on the edge of her bed in complete darkness, while rain began tapping against the window, and tears rolled soundlessly down her face. Mara found her an hour later, still sitting in the dark. The old maid said nothing. She simply sat beside Jesseline on the narrow bed, took her hand, and held it until the trembling stopped. 3 weeks later, the worst storm in 40 years descended on the Cumbrian Valley, and with it came the last man on earth who should have crossed the threshold of Dunmere Hall. Cassiel Aldermore had not always been a man who kept the world at arm's length. As a boy, he had raced through the wind-swept corridors of Aldermore Keep with laughter loud enough to echo off the ancient stone walls overlooking the northern sea. He had climbed the cliffs behind the estate with bare feet and salt-crusted hands, chasing gulls, while his mother watched nervously from the terrace above. He had believed, with the simple certainty of a child who had never been wounded, that the world rewarded those who loved it openly. The estate itself reflected the family's immense reach. Aldermore Keep sat upon a granite headland where the Cumbrian coast curved violently northward, its towers visible for miles across the gray water. Below the cliffs, a private harbor sheltered merchant vessels that connected the Aldermore shipping empire to ports in France, Denmark, and the Baltic. Inland, the family's holdings stretched across thousands of acres of farmland, timber forests, and iron mines that had generated wealth for generations. Politicians courted Cassiel's opinion on trade policy. Bankers adjusted interest rates based on his investment decisions. His name alone could shift the outcome of parliamentary votes without him setting foot inside Westminster. At 36, Duke Cassiel Aldermore was among the most powerful men in northern England, and he had never felt more completely alone. The isolation had not arrived suddenly. It had been built carefully, stone by stone, by a woman named Vylora Sinclair. Cassiel met Vylora during a London season 3 years earlier at a charity banquet hosted by the Marchioness of Kensington. She entered the room wearing ivory silk that seemed to absorb candlelight rather than reflect it, and every conversation within 20 feet softened the moment she smiled. Vylora possessed the rare ability to make whichever man she addressed feel as though he were the only person in the room worth speaking to. Cassiel, who had spent years deflecting the attention of ambitious women pursuing his title and wealth, found himself disarmed by what he believed was her lack of ambition. She asked nothing of him. She mentioned neither his estates nor his income. She spoke instead about poetry, about the loneliness of crowded ballrooms, about how difficult it was to trust anyone whose affection might be purchased by proximity to power. The irony nearly destroyed him later. Their courtship progressed rapidly. Within months, London society treated the match as inevitable. Cassiel opened his finances to support her family's struggling estates without hesitation. He commissioned a suite of private rooms at Aldermore Keep to be redecorated specifically for her arrival. He spoke about marriage before his mother, his solicitors, and the closest members of his social circle with a confidence that made his eventual humiliation infinitely more public. The discovery arrived on the November evening inside Valora's London townhouse. Cassiel had come early to collect her for a dinner engagement and found instead a letter left carelessly open upon her writing table. The letter, written in a hand he did not recognize, revealed a secret relationship that had clearly continued for months alongside his own courtship. The author was Lord Cavendish Thorne, a man Cassiel had considered a casual acquaintance. Valora had been meeting him regularly at a private residence in Chelsea, while maintaining the appearance of exclusive devotion to the Duke. Cassiel confronted her that same evening. Valora's response contained no remorse. Instead, she studied him with a composure so cold it chilled him more deeply than the betrayal itself. "You offered stability, Cassiel. Cavendish offered something you never could. Do not pretend you believed I chose you for sentiment." The words gutted him with surgical precision, not because they were cruel, but because they confirmed a fear he had carried silently since childhood, that his wealth would always stand between him and any genuine human connection, that people saw the estate, the title, the ships, and the mines long before they ever saw him. London society feasted on the scandal for months. Women whispered behind gloved hands at the opera. Men exchanged knowing glances across club tables. Even people who barely knew Cassiel seemed to derive satisfaction from the humiliation of a powerful man, fooled by a beautiful woman's performance. Cassiel withdrew from public life almost entirely afterward. Invitations accumulated unopened inside his study. His mother, Dowager Duchess Meridia Aldermore, watched her son's retreat with growing anguish. She visited his study one December evening, carrying a tray of roasted chicken and warm bread after discovering he had missed supper for the third consecutive night. "You are punishing the entire world for one woman's dishonesty." Cassiel continued writing correspondence without raising his head. "I am protecting myself from repeating a mistake." Meridia set the tray beside him firmly. Protection and imprisonment look remarkably similar from the outside, Cassiel. He said nothing. The Dowager Duchess studied the exhaustion carved into her son's face and felt a grief no title or fortune could remedy. She feared he would spend the remainder of his life sealed inside the walls of Aldermore Keep, growing older alongside ledgers and silence, while the enormous estate echoed with the absence of everything that mattered. On the afternoon before the great storm, Cassiel traveled south toward Carlisle to attend a meeting with industrial investors whose support he needed for a new shipping route along the western coast. The journey required passing through the Cumbrian Valley, where Dunmere land bordered the public road for nearly 4 miles. Cassiel had made the trip before, and always ensured his carriage moved through Dunmere territory quickly and without stopping. The feud between their families meant nothing personal to him. He had been 13 when Sir Alistair died. He remembered the night only vaguely, recalled shouting and servants rushing through corridors, while his father paced the study with a look Cassiel had never seen before. His father had insisted for years that Alistair's death was a tragic accident, that the Aldermores had done everything possible to help, and that Lord Everard Dunmere's accusations were born from grief rather than truth. Cassiel had no reason to doubt his father's account, but he also had no desire to provoke a confrontation with a man whose bitterness had calcified into something permanent and dangerous. Then the sky opened. The storm arrived with a violence that stunned even experienced coachmen. Rain fell so heavily that visibility collapsed to mere feet within minutes. Wind tore branches from ancient oaks lining the valley road, while the river that ran parallel to the highway swelled past its banks with terrifying speed. Somewhere near the northern bridge, a fallen tree struck the front wheel of Cassiel's carriage, with enough force to overturn it completely. Cassiel pulled himself from the wreckage, while rain hammered against his body and blood ran warmly from a gash above his left brow. His coachman, shaken but uninjured, pointed through the downpour toward the only lights visible for miles in any direction, the glowing windows of Dunmere Hall. The moment Cassiel Aldermore appeared in the corridor of Dunmere Hall, dripping rainwater and blood onto the polished stone floor, the household fractured into silent chaos. Lord Everard stood rigid at the head of the dining table, his face darkening with every second that passed. Lady Perpetua gripped her wineglass so tightly that her knuckles whitened beneath her gloves. Bah! The guests, who moments earlier had been laughing over roasted venison and honey parsnips, now sat frozen in the kind of silence that precedes either violence or disaster. Ravenna leaned toward Corabel with barely contained fury. "He cannot stay here. Father will never allow it." Lord Everard's voice cut through the room like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "The Aldermore name has not been spoken inside these walls for 23 years. I see no reason to begin tonight." Cassiel stood motionless in the corridor entrance, blood still tracing a thin line down the left side of his face, while rainwater pooled beneath his boots. His bearing carried no aggression, no defiance. Only the controlled composure of a man assessing whether the people before him intended to send a wounded traveler back into a deadly storm. Then Jesselyn stepped forward from the shadows near the wall where she had been standing unnoticed throughout the evening. She had watched her father's face harden. She had watched her sisters whisper with sharp, excited cruelty. She had watched 40 guests hold their breath, waiting to see whether Lord Everard Dunmere would turn away an injured man because of a surname, and something inside her refused to remain silent any longer. "He is injured, father. The storm has destroyed the road. Whatever history exists between our families, we cannot send a wounded man into weather that no man could survive." The dining room held its breath. Lord Everard turned toward his eldest daughter with a look caught between disbelief and cold fury. "You dare speak on behalf of this household regarding the Aldermores? I speak on behalf of basic decency. Nothing more." The words left her mouth before she could measure their cost. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Lady Perpetua closed her eyes briefly as though absorbing a blow. Ravenna stared at Jesseline with open contempt. But Lord Everard, conscious of 40 aristocratic witnesses watching his response, understood that sending a duke into a fatal storm would damage his reputation far more severely than one night of unwelcome hospitality. He straightened his coat slowly. "One night, the East Wing. He will not dine with this family." Then he returned to his chair without looking at Cassiel or Jesseline again. Jesseline led the Duke through the dim corridors of the East Wing in silence, carrying a candle in one hand and a basin of warm water in the other. Servants had been instructed not to attend the Aldermore guest, an act of petty cruelty disguised as protocol, so Jesseline handled it herself. The guest chamber at the far end of the corridor sat directly across from her own room. It had not been used in years and smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but the fireplace still drew properly, and the linens, though plain, were clean. Jesseline lit the fire, while Cassiel stood near the doorway, watching her with quiet attention. "You did not need to do that," he said finally, "challenging your father before his guests." Jesseline placed the basin on the washstand and turned toward him with a composure that betrayed nothing of the fear still trembling inside her chest. "Sit down, Your Grace. That wound above your brow needs cleaning before it becomes infected." Cassiel studied her face for a moment longer than politeness required, then sat in the chair beside the fireplace without further argument. Jesseline worked carefully, dampening a clean cloth and pressing it gently against the gash, while firelight flickered across the stone walls around them. The cut was shallow but ragged, filled with grit from the road. She cleaned it methodically while Cassiel sat still beneath her hands, his jaw tight but his breathing steady. Outside, the storm threw itself against the windows with renewed fury, as though offended by the small circle of warmth the fire had managed to create. "You are Lord Everard's eldest daughter." Jesseline kept her eyes on the wound. "I am. Yet you sleep in the east wing, beside the servants' staircase and the linen closets." The observation landed with uncomfortable precision. Jesseline paused momentarily, then continued cleaning. "The east wing is quieter. I prefer it." Cassiel said nothing for several seconds. Then, quietly enough that she almost missed it, he spoke again. "You are a poor liar, Miss Dunmere, but an extraordinarily kind one." Jesseline felt heat rise unexpectedly into her face, and turned away to rinse the cloth in the basin, so he would not see it. The storm raged beyond the windows with undiminished violence, shaking the old glass panes in their frames, while wind howled through gaps in the stonework. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, while fire crackled softly between them. Then Cassiel broke the silence with a question she did not expect. "Do you believe your uncle's death was our family's fault?" Jesseline's hand stilled against the cloth. The question carried no challenge, no defensiveness. Only the tone of a man who had spent years carrying a burden he never chose, and wanted to understand whether the person standing before him carried the same one. She answered honestly, because something about the exhaustion in his voice made dishonesty feel impossible. "I believe my father needed someone to blame. Grief without a target becomes unbearable. Whether the blame was deserved, I have never been certain." The words hung between them in the firelit room while rain battered the ancient walls outside. Cassiel looked at her differently then, not with pity, not with attraction, with recognition, the look of someone encountering honesty so unguarded that it momentarily disarmed every defense he had constructed over years of careful withdrawal. "My father spent his final years insisting your uncle's death haunted him more than any business failure or political defeat. He wrote to Lord Everard 7 times requesting a proper inquiry so the truth could be established. Every letter was returned unopened." Jesseline absorbed this quietly. She had never heard that detail before. It did not surprise her. "My father does not seek truth, Your Grace. He seeks control. The feud gives him both." Something shifted in the room then, not dramatically. Not with the theatrical force of a ballroom revelation, but with the slow, unmistakable weight of two people recognizing in each other a loneliness so familiar it required no further explanation. Cassiel watched the fire for a long moment before speaking again, with a quietness that felt less guarded than anything he had said all evening. "I have not spoken honestly with anyone in nearly 3 years. I had forgotten what it felt like." Jesseline looked toward the rain-streaked window. "Then we have that much in common, Your Grace." Though my silence has lasted considerably longer, the fire settled lower between them. Outside, the wind had begun to ease slightly, though rain continued its relentless assault on the old stone. Jesseline finished wrapping a clean bandage around the wound and stepped back. The storm should pass by morning. "I will bring breakfast before the household wakes, so you may leave without further confrontation." She turned toward the door. Before she reached it, Cassiel spoke once more. "Miss Dunmere, thank you. Not for the bandage. For being the only person in this house who saw an injured man before she saw a surname." Jesseline paused in the doorway without turning around. For a moment her composure wavered, just enough that the candlelight caught the shine of something forming in her eyes. Then she stepped into the dark corridor and closed the door quietly behind her. She did not sleep that night. Neither did he. The storm cleared before dawn, leaving the valley floor flooded and the roads buried beneath mud and broken branches. Casil departed Dunmere Hall through the servants' entrance before the household stirred. Exactly as Jesseline had arranged, she watched his borrowed horse disappear down the valley road from her bedroom window, while pale morning light crept across the waterlogged fields below. She expected never to see him again. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at Dunmere Hall addressed to Lord Everard Dunmere. The handwriting belonged to Duke Cassiel Aldermore. Lord Everard opened it in his study with the bearing of a man handling something venomous. The letter contained a formal expression of gratitude for the shelter provided during the storm and a request, phrased with impeccable diplomatic precision, to discuss the possibility of reopening commercial negotiations between the two families regarding shared access to the western shipping routes. Lord Everard nearly tore the letter in half before Lady Perpetua stopped him. The shipping routes have cost us £17,000 in lost revenue over the past 4 years, Everard. Refusing to even discuss the matter is no longer pride, it is financial recklessness. Lord Everard stared at his wife for a long, hostile moment. Then he placed the letter on his desk without destroying it, and said nothing further. The first meeting took place at a neutral location, a solicitor's office in Carlisle, and concerned shipping logistics exclusively. The second meeting 3 weeks later occurred at a private club in Penrith and lasted considerably longer than the agenda required. By the fourth meeting, Cassiel had been formally, if reluctantly, invited to Dunmere Hall for dinner. Lord Everard treated these encounters as purely strategic concessions. He sat rigidly through every conversation, answered questions with the minimum words required, and ensured at least 2 witnesses remained present at all times. But the commercial advantages Cassiel offered were undeniable, and Lord Everard's finances could no longer sustain the luxury of absolute refusal. What Lord Everard did not notice because he was watching ledgers instead of faces was that Cassiel's attention during every visit drifted consistently toward one person. Jesseline served tea during the first dinner. She managed the seating arrangement during the second. She resolved a minor crisis involving a collapsed kitchen shelf during the third, while Cassiel watched her calmly direct 3 panicking servants with the quiet authority of someone who had been holding things together long before anyone thought to thank her. During the fourth visit, a candle toppled near the dining curtains, and Jesseline extinguished the flame with her bare hands before anyone else had even risen from their chairs. She wrapped her burned palm in a napkin beneath the table afterward and continued pouring wine as though nothing had happened. Cassiel saw. Nobody else did. After that same visit, Cassiel requested a private walk through the estate gardens, under the pretense of discussing boundary lines relevant to the shipping agreement. Lord Everard, eager to advance the commercial terms, instructed Jesseline to accompany the Duke and answer any questions about the property. They walked beside the stone wall overlooking the valley, while cold autumn wind pressed against their coats. "Your father does not enjoy my visits," Cassiel observed. "My father does not enjoy most things, Your Grace. But he respects financial advantage above personal feeling." A faint smile crossed Cassiel's face before disappearing. He studied the valley below them with the same careful attention he had given her on the night of the storm. "You speak about your family with remarkable clarity for someone living inside their shadow." Jesseline paused beside the garden wall. Shadows are easiest to understand for the people standing in them. Cassiel turned toward her fully then, and the look in his eyes carried something she had not felt directed at her since Leoric Ashenden vanished from her life 7 years earlier. Not admiration for her appearance, not sympathy for her circumstances. Something rarer, respect for her mind. During a later walk, they paused beside the stone bridge overlooking the lower meadow, while geese crossed the water in formation below them. "Why did you truly come back?" Jesseline asked, without looking at him. The shipping agreement could have been handled through solicitors. Cassiel was quiet for several seconds. "Because on the night of the storm, you were the first person in years who spoke to me as though my name did not matter, and I wanted to know whether that was exceptional or simply who you are." Jocelyn turned toward him. "And what did you conclude?" "That it is simply who you are, which makes it more exceptional than you realize." The honesty in his voice settled into a place inside her chest that had been hollow for so long she had forgotten it could hold anything at all. The visits continued with increasing frequency through the autumn months. Society noticed almost immediately. Gossip spread through Cumbrian drawing rooms with the speed and heat of fire through dry timber. The Aldermore Duke visiting Dunmere Hall repeatedly. Impossible. Have you seen how he watches the eldest daughter? Surely not. She is past 30 and entirely ordinary. Inside the manor, the reaction was far more volatile. Lord Everard treated the situation as a commercial arrangement and nothing more, refusing to acknowledge what was becoming visible to everyone around him. Lady Perpetua, whose plans to exile Jesseline to Windermere had been quietly suspended since the visits began, now hovered around her eldest daughter with a strange, calculating attentiveness that made Jesseline deeply uncomfortable. "You should wear the green silk on Thursday. It complements your coloring." Jesseline stared at her mother in bewilderment. "You have never commented on my clothing before." Lady Perpetua simply adjusted a curl near Jesseline's temple and walked away without answering. The sisters responded with immediate and unified hostility. Ravenna arrived at Dunmere unannounced one weekend. Her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, she refused to explain and cornered Jesseline in the drawing room. "Do you understand what you are doing? Entertaining the attention of an Aldermore? After everything that family took from us." "He took nothing from us, Ravenna. He was 13 years old when Uncle Alistair died." Ravenna's jaw tightened dangerously. "Do not be naive, Jesseline. Men like Cassiel Aldermore do not pursue women like you without ulterior purpose." The words landed exactly where Ravenna intended them to land. Jesseline held her composure until her sister left the room, then sat alone beside the cold fireplace, while doubt pressed heavily against the warmth she had only just begun allowing herself to feel. Gorabel's approach was subtler and considerably more dangerous. During a dinner gathering in Penrith, she arranged through an intermediary for Valora Sinclair to be among the invited guests. Valora arrived wearing midnight blue velvet with diamonds arranged through her dark hair like scattered frost. She moved through the room with the effortless confidence of a woman accustomed to capturing every gaze in her vicinity. Throughout the evening, Valora positioned herself near Cassiel whenever possible. She laughed warmly at his remarks. She referenced memories from their past courtship with deliberate intimacy. She touched his arm lightly during conversation, in ways designed to suggest familiarity that had never truly ended. Jesseline watched from across the room while something cold and familiar settled inside her chest. The same feeling she had carried during the months she waited for letters that never arrived. The quiet, suffocating certainty that she was foolish to believe she had ever been chosen. Then Valora leaned toward Cassiel with a smile that seemed to soften the air between them. "You seem different lately, Cassiel. Less guarded. It suits you." Cassiel regarded her with a steadiness so controlled it might have been carved from the same granite as Aldermore Keep. "I am less inclined to tolerate deception. That is the only difference worth noting." Valora's smile froze, then dissolved entirely. She excused herself within minutes and did not approach him again for the remainder of the evening. Across the room, Jesseline released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Later that evening, as guests began departing into the cold night, Cassiel found Jesseline standing beside the cloakroom entrance, holding her shawl against the draft. "You arranged that beautifully," he said quietly. She looked at him with confusion. "I did not arrange anything this evening. I meant the way you endured it. Watching someone from my past attempt to unsettle you without allowing it to change how you treated anyone in the room. Most people cannot manage that kind of composure without it becoming performance. Yours never does." Jesseline studied the floor tiles for a moment. "It is not composure, Your Grace. It is practice. I have had 7 years of it." Something behind Cassiel's guarded exterior softened then, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone watching closely enough. And Jesseline, who had spent her entire life watching closely because nobody ever watched her, saw it clearly. The confrontation arrived on a cold November evening, 6 days before Jesseline was originally scheduled to leave for Windermere. Cassiel had returned to Dunmere Hall to finalize the shipping agreement with Lord Everard, and arrived earlier than expected due to favorable road conditions. A servant directed him toward the study, but as he passed through the corridor adjacent to the drawing room, raised voices stopped him. Ravina spoke first, her tone sharp with the particular bitterness of a woman whose own unhappiness had long since curdled into cruelty toward anyone who might escape the same fate. "She is making a fool of herself and humiliating this entire family. An alder more, of all the desperate choices she could make." Corabel's voice followed, quieter but no less corrosive. "She has always craved attention. She could not earn naturally. Now she parades herself before the one man guaranteed to cause Father Maximum distress." Florian laughed softly. "Perhaps when the Duke tires of her novelty, she will finally accept the Windermere arrangement without further drama." Cassiel stood motionless in the corridor, his jaw tightening with every word. Then Lady Perpetua spoke, and her contribution cut deeper than all 3 daughters combined. "Jesseline has always lacked the judgment to understand her own position. She inherited that weakness from my mother's side, romantic foolishness that belongs in novels rather than noble households." Lord Everard grunted in agreement from somewhere deeper inside the room. The girl was always unsuited for the expectations placed upon her. "We offered every opportunity. She squandered them through stubbornness and sentimentality." Cassiel pushed the drawing room door open without knocking. Every voice ceased instantly. Ravina's wineglass froze against her lips. Corabel's composed mask shattered into visible alarm. Florian's laughter died in her throat like a candle flame pinched between wet fingers. Lady Perpetua's face drained of color while Lord Everard rose slowly from his chair, caught between outrage and something that looked disturbingly close to shame. Cassiel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence his presence created carried more devastation than any shout could have delivered. "I have spent this evening listening to a family dismantle the only person among them who possesses genuine worth." Nobody spoke. Lord Everard's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Cassiel continued with measured precision. "Miss Dunmere managed your household while you ignored her. She organized your celebrations while you mocked her. She raised the standards of this estate through years of invisible labor, while every person in this room treated her existence as an embarrassment." Ravina attempted to interject. "You do not understand our family circumstances." "I understand cruelty. I have received enough of it from people who claimed affection to recognize it clearly when directed at someone who deserved none." The room fell silent again. "Now." Something behind Lady Perpetua's composure crumbled slowly, the way a wall crumbles when the foundation beneath it has been quietly rotting for years. Then Cassiel spoke directly to Lord Everard with a calm that carried more authority than anger ever could. "You intercepted 14 letters addressed to your daughter 7 years ago and destroyed them without her knowledge." The blood left Lord Everard's face completely. Lady Perpetua turned toward her husband with stunned confusion. "What letters? What is he talking about, Everard?" Lord Everard said nothing. His silence confirmed everything. Cassiel held the older man's gaze without flinching. "Leoric Ashenden wrote to her every week for 4 months. Every letter was burned inside your study fireplace. Your daughter spent 7 years believing she had been forgotten by the only person who ever loved her, because you decided the truth was less important than your control." The revelation detonated silently across the room. Ravina stared at her father in disbelief. Corabel's hand trembled against the arm of her chair. Even Florian looked shaken in a way Jesseline had never witnessed before. Lord Everard's voice emerged hoarsely. "How did you know about the letters?" Because Lyric Ashington currently works as a cartographer for my shipping company, he told me himself. He still carries the pain of her silence like a wound that never closed. The room held nothing but the sound of the fire crackling softly inside the grate. Cassiel stepped back from the doorway. Jessalyn Dunmere is the finest person I have encountered in 36 years of life. That this family failed to recognize it is not her tragedy. It is yours. Then he turned and walked through the corridor without looking back. He found Jessalyn in the garden, standing alone beneath the bare branches of the old elm tree overlooking the valley. The cold had turned her breath visible in the darkness, while moonlight silvered the frosted ground beneath her feet. She turned when she heard his footsteps and immediately tried to compose herself, but the tears already running silently down her face made the effort. Impossible. I heard shouting, she whispered. What happened? Cassiel stopped before her and spoke with a gentleness that stood in absolute contrast to the controlled fury he had carried. Moments earlier, the truth happened. Things your family should have told you years ago. What truth? He told her about the letters. Every word. Jessalyn listened without moving while the information settled into the hollow places inside her that 7 years of false abandonment had carved. When he finished, she could not speak for a long time. Her hands pressed against her mouth while her body shook with the kind of grief that arrives not from fresh loss, but from the sudden understanding that a wound you believed you had survived was inflicted deliberately by people you trusted. He wrote to me. She managed. Finally, through broken breathing. He kept his promise. Every single week. Jessalyn's knees buckled. Cassiel caught her gently before she fell, and for several seconds they stood together beneath the frozen elm tree, while she cried with a rawness she had not allowed herself in years. No one has ever fought for me before, she whispered against the cold night air. Cassiel held her steadily, his voice barely above the silence surrounding them. That changes tonight. The Cumbrian Midwinter Ball had been held at Harrogate Assembly Rooms for over a century, and every year the northern aristocracy treated it as the single most important social event of the season. Families that spent 11 months avoiding each other gathered beneath the same gilded ceiling for one evening of forced civility, political maneuvering, and carefully observed appearances. The ballroom itself stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across polished oak floors and walls draped in deep emerald velvet. Long tables overflowed with roasted goose, honeyed ham, poached pears and brandy, spiced apple tarts, candied chestnuts, and towers of meringue dusted with powdered sugar. Wine from Bordeaux and champagne from Reims filled crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and scattered it across every surface like liquid gold. 600 guests filled the room. Among them stood every family that mattered across the northern counties, including both the Dunmeres and the Aldermoors, beneath the same roof for the first time in over 2 decades. Lord Everard had debated refusing the invitation entirely after the confrontation at Dunmere Hall. But withdrawing from the midwinter ball would have broadcast weakness across society at precisely the moment when whispers about his family were reaching a crescendo. So he attended with his jaw clenched and his composure held together by willpower alone. Lady Perpetua stood beside him, but something fundamental had fractured between them since the night Cassiel revealed the intercepted letters. She moved through the evening with the hollow precision of a woman performing a role she no longer believed in. The sisters arrived together, their faces carrying varying shades of the same discomfort. Vervena's features held their usual sharpness, but exhaustion had deepened visibly beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly whenever she reached for her wine glass, and the confidence she once carried like armor had thinned into something fragile and uncertain. Corabelle smiled automatically at every greeting while her gaze drifted repeatedly toward the entrance, where Lord Dacian Morel had arrived 30 minutes earlier, escorting a young widow who was decidedly not his wife. Florienne stood perfectly still beside a marble pillar, wearing the sapphire necklace Osric had permitted her to display tonight, her beauty intact, but her confidence noticeably diminished. Jesseline entered the ballroom alone. Lady Perpetua had sent no gowns this time, no jewels, no instructions about hair arrangements. Since the night of Cassiel's confrontation, the family had treated Jesseline with a silence more uncomfortable than cruelty, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted permanently, without anyone willing to name what it was. Jesseline wore a simple gown of deep midnight blue, the same color she had always chosen when dressing herself without assistance. No diamonds, no pearls. Just the quiet dignity of a woman who had long since stopped trying to become visible to people determined not to see her. She expected nothing from the evening. She stood near the furthest wall, watching the enormous ballroom swirl with silk and candlelight and laughter, feeling the familiar weight of separateness pressing gently against her shoulders. Then the ballroom doors opened one final time. Duke Cassiel Aldermore entered Harrogate Assembly Rooms, and 600 people noticed simultaneously. Conversation dipped, music softened. Women straightened instinctively, while men assessed the room's shifting power dynamics with the reflexive alertness of animals sensing a change in the wind. Cassiel moved through the crowd with unhurried purpose. Several women attempted to intercept him with bright smiles and practiced greetings. A countess complimented his estates. A baron's daughter laughed too loudly at nothing while positioning herself directly in his path. Vylora Sinclair, who had secured an invitation through connections Corabelle no longer controlled, watched from beside the orchestra with calculated expectation. Cassiel walked past every one of them without pausing. He crossed the entire length of the ballroom, 600 pairs of eyes following his movement in stunned silence, and stopped directly before Jesseline Dunmere. She looked up at him with a gaze that contained neither hope nor performance. Just the steady, unprotected honesty of a woman who had stopped pretending years ago. Cassiel reached inside his coat and produced a small box covered in dark velvet. The ballroom had fallen so completely silent that the sound of the box opening was audible to guests standing 30 feet away. Inside rested a ring, unlike anything the assembled aristocracy expected. Not a towering diamond designed to announce wealth. Instead, a deep blue sapphire, modest in size but extraordinary in color. Set in a simple gold band, it looked like something chosen with thought rather than spectacle. Cassiel spoke clearly enough for his voice to carry across the silent room. "Miss Jesseline Dunmere, I have spent 3 years avoiding every ballroom in England because I believed that honesty no longer existed among people who valued status above character. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then a storm forced me through the doors of a house that despised my name. And inside that house I found the one person willing to see a wounded stranger instead of an enemy. The one person who challenged her own father before 40 guests because decency mattered more to her than approval. The one person who managed an entire household without recognition, comforted servants without expectation, and carried years of cruelty without allowing it to harden her heart." Jesseline's eyes filled with tears that caught the candlelight as they spilled silently down her face. "I have watched ambitious women perform kindness. I have watched beautiful women perform affection. I have watched clever women perform sincerity. But I have never met anyone whose goodness required no audience whatsoever." His gaze held hers with absolute steadiness. "You are the rarest person I have ever known, not because of beauty, not because of status, but because everything you are remains exactly the same whether anyone is watching or not." Jesseline's hands trembled visibly at her sides, while the weight of every lonely year pressed against the moment, threatening to break her composure entirely. Cassiel stepped closer. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" A sound escaped Jesseline that was neither word nor breath, but something broken open after years of being held impossibly tight. Her hand rose slowly to cover her mouth while tears fell freely, and her body shook with the force of emotions she had spent a decade learning to suppress. 600 guests watched in absolute silence. Then she nodded. Once, Through the tears and the trembling and the overwhelming impossibility of everything she had just heard spoken aloud by a man standing before all of Northern society, declaring that the woman they had dismissed for years was the finest person he had ever known. Yes, the word left her lips quietly, almost privately, as though it belonged to the two of them alone despite the hundreds of witnesses surrounding them. Applause erupted across the ballroom. Valora Sinclair turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Lord Everard stood motionless, his face carrying the weight of a man watching something he could neither control nor undo. Lady Perpetua pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, while tears she could not explain rolled down her powdered cheeks. Ravina stared at her eldest sister as though seeing her clearly after a lifetime of deliberate blindness. Corabelle lowered her gaze to the floor. Florian stood perfectly still beside the marble pillar, while a single tear traced a line down her flawless face, though whether it fell from jealousy or from the sudden recognition of something she herself had never been offered, not even she could say. Years passed. As Duchess of Aldermore, Jesseline carried her kindness into every corner of the vast estate, and beyond it, she learned the names of every tenant farmer across the Aldermore holdings. She visited workers' families during harsh winters, bringing blankets, medicine, and food prepared from the keep's own kitchens. She opened the estate library to village children and hired a schoolteacher for families who could not afford one. People admired her, not because she married power, but because power had not changed her. Old Mara traveled north to join the household at Aldermore Keep, and on quiet evenings the two women sat beside the fire in the private sitting room while wind rolled off the sea against the ancient stone walls. Jesseline hummed softly again during those evenings. The sound carried through the corridors like something recovered from a long and careful burial. Orksil, who had believed warmth would never return to the halls of Aldermore Keep, found himself smiling more often than he had since boyhood. He still carried the scars of Veilor's betrayal, but Jesseline's presence did not demand he forget them. She simply stood beside him with a patience that never required performance, and slowly the walls he had built around himself became unnecessary rather than dismantled. Meanwhile, the marriages that had once been celebrated so loudly inside Dunmere Hall collapsed with the quiet inevitability of foundations built on shallow ground. Pemberton Hale's controlling nature consumed Ravina's independence entirely. Freedoms she once enjoyed were quietly withdrawn. Friendships she once maintained were discouraged one by one until she existed inside a beautiful estate with no voice and no allies. Society eventually whispered about what happened behind those doors, but by then the damage had been carved too deeply to undo easily. Dacian Morel's infidelities became public knowledge after a scandal involving the wife of a sitting member of Parliament. Corabelle endured the humiliation with the composed exterior she had perfected since childhood, but the alliances she had spent years cultivating evaporated overnight. The woman who once collected influence like jewelry discovered that influence built on an unfaithful husband's reputation vanished the moment that reputation shattered. Osric Vanthorpe's control over Florian tightened with each passing year, until the vibrant young woman who once silenced rooms with her beauty became a shadow moving through an enormous house according to rules written by someone else's hand. The sapphire necklace remained locked inside a case she was no longer permitted to open without written instruction. One autumn afternoon, 3 carriages arrived at Aldermore Keep. Jesseline watched from the terrace as her sisters stepped onto the gravel drive below, their gowns less expensive than she remembered, their faces carrying the weight of exhaustion that no amount of powder could conceal. None of them could meet her eyes easily when she greeted them at the door. Ravina spoke first, and her voice, stripped of its sharpness for the first time Jesseline could remember, cracked on the second word. "We have nowhere else to go." Jesseline studied the 3 women standing before her, women who had mocked her at dinner tables, women who had compared her to servants for entertainment, women who had laughed while their father erased her from the family's future without a moment of hesitation. She saw the weariness, Ravina, no longer bothered to disguise behind sharp words. She saw the hollowness behind Carabelle's careful composure. She saw the way Florian flinched slightly when a servant closed a door too quickly behind them. And Jesseline Aldermore, Duchess of the Northern Coast, the woman her family once tried to exile to a forgotten cottage beside a quiet lake, stepped forward and embraced each of her sisters without a word of reproach. She led them inside, sat them beside the enormous fireplace overlooking the sea, and asked Mara to bring tea and warm bread and whatever comfort the kitchen could offer before supper. Because in the end, the truest measure of strength was never found in revenge. It was found in the willingness to offer grace to those who never offered it to you. And the world beyond Dunmere Hall eventually learned what Jesseline had carried quietly inside her all along. That real worth was never measured by the ring on your finger, the title beside your name, or the number of people willing to raise a glass in your honor. It was measured by what remained inside your heart after everything had been taken from you, and whether kindness still lived there when the people who once wounded you came looking for shelter from their own storms.